Welcome to the Former People Film Podcast. This past Sunday, the Polish film Ida won Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards. Derek and I had a chance to discuss this film a few months ago. Needless to say, both of us were floored by it. First off, a lot of things interest me about the film Ida or Ida, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
And Ida is correct, Ray, right? The Polish way.
Ida is how it would be pronounced in Polish. And that's sort of what's interesting about this film for me, in that even though, and I think because of it being a very minimalist aesthetic and ultimately a religious film, it has managed to translate across cultures much more easily than I thought it would. And at the same time, it's so completely ensconced in the minutia of a particular time in Polish history that I'm almost certainly convinced that people aren't really picking up on half the things that are in this film, which would be just apparently obvious to a Polish audience without having to have it spoken to.
I was thinking about that when I watched this. It's one, I am surprised this is the crossover movie for this director. I mean, it's a meditative film. It involves a lot of staring, which doesn't make it sound interesting, but actually it really is. You have to watch the faces closely. It's short, which I guess is maybe in its favor, but given its pace, it's being short kind of feels strange. Not strange for the movie, but strange for like the viewing patterns of an American audience.
I think that's true. There's an expectation, I think, of a film like this, in part given its influences, implicitly or explicitly, Robert Bresson and Tarkovsky, neither men of which are known for being, shall we say, brief.
It's interesting because, well, I mean, I guess it's obviously interesting. Let's talk about the background of this movie, because one, I think people are mistaking it for a Showa movie, and it's not.
Right. So, yeah, to provide context for this film, it begins in a convent in the early 60s. It's not explicit what year it is, but it is certainly during the Gomulka period of Poland, which, in context of the history, in the aftermath of World War II, obviously, Poland is more or less under Soviet influence throughout much of the early 50s and up through the late 50s. It was run by a Stalinist government, and that government ultimately couldn't sustain itself, and a more, for lack of a better term, moderate leader called Gomulka came in and basically had a semi-independent period where Poland was nonetheless taking its foreign policy cues from Moscow, but could set its own direction towards socialism, whatever. What it ultimately resulted in was a sort of thawing period in Poland, not unlike the thawing period you would get with Khrushchev, but a lot more liberal at the end of the day. Hence the emphasis on jazz, the explosion of Polish films at this period of time, etc., etc. In this context, we start at a convent where our lead character is basically nearing the final days of her training as a nun. She's about to take her vows, but the Mother Superior tells her, look, you have a living relative. Before you take your vows, you should go talk to her, and so on. It's not exactly accurate to call it this, but I think it gives people an idea of what to expect. It's somewhat similar to a Rumspringa event. It's like before you make your commitments in eternity, you should go and see your end.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. I was like, man, this is very Rumspringa-esque. I don't normally associate that with Catholicism, but it's interesting because what comes out of that is that she's Jewish, and that her parents were murdered. Although the exact context for that murder is a little unclear for me, actually. Because this is why I think people think this is a Showa movie, and I don't think it is.
No, it's not unrelated, but the context is different. And we'll get to that as it's a build-up to this. But basically, right, her parents were killed not by Germans, but by Poles. and her aunt is, she discovers, is basically a judge at this point in her life, but back in the early 50s, again during the Stalinist period, she was a prosecutor for the state, and and effectively an agent of extermination in a way. This was at a time when, frankly, people who aren't Polish won't really get this, is that there was basically a civil war period immediately after World War II. The communists and the nationalists obviously had, shall we say, disagreements on what the nation ultimately would look like post occupation by the Germans, and it was an intense civil war, and many people died. Ultimately, the nationalists lost. In that process, many who did survive were basically abused by the state system, were put down and suppressed. She was an instrument of that. Right. Policy. We get some, as the film goes on, we get perhaps some sense of her motivation for doing so. But we'll get into that later. And it's also, again, important to note why the period of time in this film is important. The fact that this is the Gomulka thaw period means that she's already, although an important figure, a powerful figure, is sort of figure from the past. She's a little bit ostracized is too strong, but she's past due. She's beyond her point in history.
Right, and she's so strongly associated with that. Now, is it significant in Polish culture that she was also Jewish, that the aunt's Jewish?
In a way, yes, it is. And it's important because it emphasizes the convoluted complication in her relationship, her relationship to the Poles she encounters, her relationship to the state, and then et cetera, et cetera. Part of the issue, not unsurprising, is that before World War II, during and after, a lot of Jews who did survive sought, be it either refuge or hope or some alternative future in the Communist Party. And so she went to it. Now, what's interesting in that is that in a lot of Polish minds, the two identities, being Jewish and being a communist, unfortunately is thought of as the same thing. It's absolutely not, but it's still true that a lot of Jews did find some place in the Communist Party.
Yeah, so I find it interesting that they don't explicate her. I mean, like, the director does not remove her sense of guilt. It is clear. But if you don't understand the history, you don't know why she seems so erratic. And, I mean, she's acting like a 20-year-old. Right. In the film. And you realize part of that is out of, like, guilt and desperation.
You do get a sense as the film goes on that her choice not only to enter into the Communist Party, to be a prosecutor, to use the authority to threaten people around her, and her desire to be sort of materialistically young and vivacious and interesting, she is a very interesting person, is all sort of floating around the central idea of guilt and powerlessness, which again will be revealed. But as you can probably take from the hint, that it has something to do with the death of Ida's mother and father, her sister and brother-in-law.
Right.
And so the film is in some sense a road movie as well. So after this reveal has been made to Ida, they go to basically the village where her parents were hiding and where they were killed.
What's interesting about this is we're going through it, and I'm going to say this is only like the first 20 minutes of the film, right? And it sounds like a lot's been exposed. But when you're watching this film, it's really important to realize that even though you're getting so much information and so much detail, I mean, even down to the way those shots are composed, that it's actually amazingly slowly paced. And I'm kind of in awe, particularly in the first half, how the director does that. It gives you that much information and starts a road movie, and yet somehow maintains a pace that feels pretty languid.
Absolutely. It's a tempo which feels most appropriate for a religious film. I mean, this is. Do you get the sense that the film adopts the tempo of monastery life?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, and it's also interesting that it very much seems like a religious artwork, and it's not a comfortable one. I mean, because there's a lot of ways if this movie was a cliched religious movie in either direction, either Catholic or Jewish, that there are obvious choices in the story that aren't made. And I don't want to blow those yet because we haven't got to that point. But it's interesting that the tone, the somberness, the color, the incredibly careful tableau shots that this movie is full of. I mean, there's just so many of these images from this film you could just take out and frame just perfectly.
You definitely pick a lot of filmic references and influences on this film, but ultimately, and I think that even the director would admit this, it's in some sense an attempt to reproduce the photographs of Poland at the time, and I think he does an exceptional job of doing that, in part of which, like, there are certain sections of the country where it hasn't really changed that much, so you are going to get a lot of that, but also and even not even just the tableaus, but just the music that's in, the way that the people wear the clothing. You are meant to, as it were, savor the visual imagery you are getting. And I think I even saw in an interview that the director says that a lot of people see this as a bleak film, and certainly there's darkness to it, but in his mind it was in much regard a nostalgia for his youth of the period of that time, that sort of cool aesthetic that was really developing in Poland at the time. I mean, and also let's not forget the importance of jazz in this film, which we really haven't discussed, but
it's all over the place.
And outside, a little interesting detail, outside of the United States, Britain, and France, Polish jazz is actually a very huge thing for the country, and at the time, you probably encountered it indirectly through the work of Krzysztof Komeda, who's most famous in this country for writing the music and the famous lullaby theme for Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah, and the jazz is so interesting because it sounds just, at first, parts of it sound just like American jazz when they're playing Coltrane. But parts of it, you hear this Polish and even hints of klezmer in the jazz that you wouldn't hear in American jazz. And the other thing is this jazz is basically countercultural in the way that jazz was more in the States in the 40s, or in the way that maybe rock and roll was in the 60s. It's filling a specific cultural niche that it doesn't for us in the States.
Every cliche you can imagine the Polish authorities would have said about jazz music at the time was said. Like an export from the decadent West, blah, 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 blah. All of that shit was thrown at it. And it's funny, like, you're right, today we wouldn't bat an eye on it. Even, if we were, Americans in the 60s at the time listening to that, we wouldn't think of it as, like you said, being countercultural by any stretch of the term. If anything, it would feel arguably a little conservative, not entirely, but a little bit. It's just the different context. But again, that context is essential to the whole tone and tempo of the film.
And you contrast that to these villages that what they're in this part of the movie. And those villages they've changed since maybe 1850. I mean, they're run down, the apartments are ancient. And they look pre-20th century. The village,
They are, absolutely. I mean, in fact, it's no small thing that when there's a minor detail in the film, like the jazz player comes in and says they're at a gig where they're celebrating the town's anniversary, and if you look on the banners for the anniversary, it's the 550th anniversary of the town. So to put that in context, where America is like 250-ish years old. It's you get a sense that this is older, and the thing is, even to this day, parts of the fields that old. Like my aunt was telling me when she visited our parts of our family 7 years ago. I mean, like it was also in a poor rural area. Like one of the family members didn't even have indoor plumbing 7 years ago.
Yeah, I can't. In the States, the only equivalent would be like Appalachia in the 80s. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's exactly what I was going to compare it to. That level of poverty and also, frankly, ancientness. I mean, maybe ancient's too strong a term, but it's definitely a lifestyle closer to the sort of pre-industrial revolution than post.
right. I mean, it's interesting because it feels like Poland industrialized kind of incompletely. Period. Like end of discussion. I need to go do more research on that. Like when you first look at the building, your buildings, you're like, "Oh, this is Stalinist," and you actually see the wear and tear. And I'm like, "No, this is older than that. This is not like concrete rot. This is just old architecture that hasn't been maintained." Now, I mean, when they go out to the village house, which is where things really start to pick up, if that's the right word for this movie,
Right. No, it's right. Yeah, that's where they encounter the family that, important to emphasize, was hiding the Jewish family. I think it maybe even was the Jewish family's original home. But as you are well aware, and I'm well aware, after everything had happened in World War II, and frankly the borders just shifted westward, the resettlement and redistribution of property was a big thing. It is now owned by the family, and they both go in trying to obviously figure out, wanting to get a sense of what happened. And Wanda's approach to it is to basically threaten and use her authority to get the people to speak. Naturally, as one would respond to such things, they play dumb or basically try to get her to go away. Ida says nothing, essentially, but because she is a representative of the church, she is seen as someone not threatening. And frankly, she isn't. She isn't really interested in threatening anyone. She's frankly more interested in observing most of the time.
right? She's just watching these people. I mean, it's interesting to me because she doesn't forgive them either. I don't want to rush too far ahead. It's not like her gaze lacks judgment, but it's just observing things, taking things in, and kind of forcing people to. She's almost acting as a mirror, like with her aunt, with the family that they encounter out at the house, even with the jazz singer she kind of flirts with. But when I say flirt, that's might be too strong, at least for that part of the movie. She talks to.
Right. I think in my mind, I always saw her as having an innocent gaze, largely because of her history. Right. This is arguably her first time outside of the convent, and to her, and she, doesn't really have any context for her family's history, what's going on in Poland, et cetera, et cetera. She probably has some sense of it, not a whole lot, and I think there is probably judgment in her eyes, but I think it's the judgment of someone who's always been in and never understood anything outside of the Catholic Church.
Right. And her aunt responds to her as like, "Why are you wasting your life? Why won't you do anything? Don't you have carnal thoughts?" is one of the things she asks her. And that actually gets more and more elevated until after the house.
There's clearly a contrast going on between Ida and her aunt Wanda. And it may be oversimplistic to say this, but I think it's getting at the right direction. Ida clearly is a religious aesthete in every sense of the term. I mean, that is what she's trained to do. That's how she responds to the world. Wanda, being clearly a member of the Communist Party, as in part, but also just fundamentally materialist atheistic woman, is concerned of just your typical human day-to-day interactions. I think she probably looks upon Ida in a way, frankly, I would, and maybe I think this line even comes from, maybe it's Victor Hugo, and he says like a beautiful nun is a tragic waste kind of attitude towards it. And you're right, she says, look, why would you you hide your hair, you have beautiful red hair, you hide your hair, you don't as you said, you don't have any thoughts. I mean, what good are your vows if you don't have any lusts or any chance to risk or challenge them? And that plays in, and it's fundamentally ingrained in their characters, their identities, which becomes an important part as the film goes on. It arguably is one of the important themes of the film, is the flexibility or the lack of flexibility of identity, and proceeds to go from there. And yeah, you're right. Their initial visit to the family house doesn't really result in any real information other than the father of the family, the patriarch of the family who was protecting the family at the time, is in the hospital. The hospital in the closest town, which is where they're going to immediately afterwards.
So they head there after. Well, there's the scene in the hotel with the jazz musicians where Ida and her aunt really clash. She goes out and she talks to the boy I mentioned earlier. She kind of flirts. She's just also very frank about her situation in a way that's disarming. She's just like, I'm a nun. I discovered that I'm Jewish. I learned who my parents are.
I'm a nun. I guess I'm also Jewish now.
And, the guy completely doesn't really understand this. And he goes, well, I have a little bit of gypsy in me. And she just sort of looks at him and almost, she doesn't shrug, but almost shrugs. I mean, it's just like, you don't really understand what I'm telling you, sort of look.
Well, I was just going to say, the thing about her discovering her Jewishness is interesting, because, I think the Jewish community, well, there are a lot of Jewish communities who respond to this, will probably, or who would watch this, may feel her Jewish identity is kind of weirdly in flux, because it's clearly not religious, obviously. It's not even sort of weirdly cultural, because again, she's in the convent. She never really knew her family. As far as she knew, she was just a Polish Catholic. So it's just information. Ultimately, it's history, but she's really just in the process of knowing what that means. It's almost like her Jewish identity is something which is important to her, not so much because it's Jewish or Polish or something else, as much as it's different. It's not what she had anticipated. And she's just trying to understand, well, if my identity is in question, what does this mean? And who am I as a result of it?
Right. And the jazz singer kind of asked her, are you going back to the convent? And she's like, of course.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's all she knows, and it's fundamentally, a part of her. Now, admittedly, as the film goes on, I mean, it becomes increasingly an opportunity for her to question that or wonder what exactly she wants. And, some people might think it's metaphoric to say, the Jewish background of Poland is something people don't talk about. And it comes up in the film around this time. Obviously, the family tries to play dumb when it comes to the question of hiding the family. The Wanda talks to people in the bar, and they are sort of coy about it. The priest that Ida talks to while she's sleeping in the local church says, Jews basically kept to themselves, and it's an interesting thing. I think people in the United States probably take that as metaphorically Poland not wanting to talk about it because of, I think a lot of them would say that there's like an inherent anti-Semitism in the core, and I can definitely see why people would read that. As someone who has Polish background, I can tell you, Poles, when they're amongst themselves, they don't talk about anything but World War II. And, it's one of those things where it's so near to their memory. It's more like, if you're not talking about it with your immediately close friends or relatives about what went on, it's like, it's so close and so painful, you don't talk about it lightly.
Well, as a person with Jewish identity, I think, and a somewhat similar background, actually, about family that converted, although not all to Catholicism, I am fascinated by the way they handle this, because there's a bunch of cliches that could have happened. Right. The movie does not do. Like, she does not run off and convert to Judaism or revert to Judaism. She wouldn't have to convert, but she doesn't. There's not a rabbi in this movie. A rabbi's only mentioned once.
Jewish religiosity really isn't the point of the film, right? You would agree?
Yeah, and neither is Jewish. Like Jewish identity is, but not Jewish identity in a completely separate way. Part of what seems to be the background of this is like Polishness can't extract itself from its largely integrated Jewish past, because it was a highly. I mean, the shuttles weren't integrated, but it was one of the most Jewish countries in a lot of ways for a long time.
It absolutely was. I mean, it was. I think the phrase I heard most. It's like Poland was a place where Jews came to live for 1,000 years and died for 5 years. Yeah, it's absolutely part of the culture, and it's funny related to this because obviously we're recording this around the end of the Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year's holidays. A friend of mine in my office who is Jewish was trying to look for like a Jewish restaurant or catering outfit in Chicago where he could get some of the traditional Jewish foods for his Hanukkah party. And he says, it's funny, the only place I could go to get latkes, blintzes, all these other foods, et cetera, were only Russian or Polish restaurants. And my response is the reason that's the case is because the cultures are so intertwined. I mean, it's very, very similar. And it's funny, like if you even think of things like Yiddishkeit, Jewish humor, or various attitudes towards life, it to me, I guess I always responded so well to that kind of thing because it just didn't feel that different from my own background and the humor of my family and whatnot. And you're right, it's especially Poland after World War II, and even to today, it has this reputation of being the most homogeneous country, and it is, but it's so artificially constructed now. It never was that homogeneous. There were always mixing.
That's the sorting of the 50s, right? That's the sorting of Stalin.
It is.
I mean, ironically, that Stalin got to achieve through his nation-moving policies what Hitler couldn't, which was to have fairly ethnically homogeneous countries in Central Europe, which was impossible for almost 2,000 years prior. I mean, it's not just Jews and Poles. I mean, how many people? I mean, like when you read the history of Poland, which at one time is part of Russia, and at another time it's its own thing, and then another time it's like part of pagan Lithuania, and then it's Poland-Lithuania as one country, and then, I mean, it's, it almost gets absorbed. It gets absorbed by Sweden at one point, right?
Yes, during that's the deluge period. Poland, the end of the golden age of Poland is brought down by a Swedish invasion and a Russian invasion, which ultimately was repulsed, but basically, yes, it was under control. And also the Polish king at one point in time was simultaneously the king of Poland and the king of Sweden, hence why this is the Vasa family, which is why these things gets complicated.
And another thing to remember is from the Kievan Rus period up until probably, I don't know, 200 years ago, Poland had boyars and things. So it's hard for me to even describe to people, what Eastern Europe kind of is. And this is just from the fact that I have family background there. It's not the fact that I've lived there or anything. It's just the history of that area is so intermixed, and its ethnic sorting was painful. I mean, I think it's traumatic in a way that even some of those countries I'm not going to say even, they are obviously still dealing with them because that's why we have movies like this. I mean, it just hasn't. I wanted to ask you, though, one of the more interesting things about the Stalin period of Poland and its relationship to the Jewish, to the Shoah, to these kind of executions of Jews that we'll get to in a minute. Poland, of all the Soviet countries, was the only one who didn't make internal use of the Shoah in their propaganda during the Stalinist period. I know part of that is because Poles were also part of the people who were being killed. They're probably either the second largest ethnic group exterminated or the third. It's hard to say between them and the Roma. But I just don't understand why the communist authorities went that route when they went the opposite direction in every other country.
So ultimately, I don't have a good answer for it other than to say the Polish Communist Party did use adopt anti-Semitic attitudes at the end of the 60s. I think it was just a means of trying to figure out a way to, I don't know, get the country to be in line by playing up certain prejudices related to the church. But you're right. I don't ultimately know why the
In the 50s, why they did that, right?
Why in the 50s they just didn't bring up the Holocaust.
Yeah, I mean, they just didn't. It wasn't part of like Polish Soviet education. It just wasn't. It's just interesting to me because like the narrative, for example, around the Great Patriotic War, the liberation of Sobibor, and that kind of thing in Russia itself. I mean, that was a point of pride. A point of pride so much that Stalin reversed execution orders over it.
So what's interesting about Poland is that in the aftermath, the history of World War II is actually heavily controlled. So, for example, obviously you're aware of the Katyn massacre. That we know now was Russian done. They killed basically 20,000 officers and intelligentsia of Poland, the leadership, who was caught on the Soviet side of that war. That during the war they said, oh, the Germans did it. Then the Germans found evidence and said the Russians did it. Then when the Russians won, they said the Germans did it. End of story. Shut the fuck up. They also went out of their way to suggest that the Home Army, which was the sort of underground resistance, had no ultimate role or significant role to play. It was only the Red Army and the Polish support of the Red Army which won the war. Now, tied to that, on some level, which may be the reason why they didn't talk about it too much, is that the activities to save Jews or to get Jews out of Poland, or at least to not get them killed, was associated with the Home Army more so than the communist underground. So
Right.
It may be a roundabout way of dealing with the Home Army by just trying to avoid the topic altogether.
Right, because the communist underground would have wanted to get rid of the shuttles anyway. I mean, they wouldn't have wanted to kill the Jews, but they would have wanted to integrate them. So actively saving shuttle Jews probably wouldn't have been on the agenda for the Red Army. I mean, just frankly, it wasn't in Russia. Like they would obviously take as many Jewish, like secular Jews out of that as they could, but they wouldn't be saving religious Jews in mass.
For Russia, in Russia you can imagine they could get a lot of cachet out of their role in the Holocaust, in part because a lot of in the other non-Polish countries of Eastern Europe, a lot of the nationalist resistance to the communists were also people who were more likely to be collaborators with the Nazis and more likely to participate in the killing of Jews. Ukraine was a very notorious example of this. Some of the Baltic states were, not as much. It's really the Ukraine where a lot of this shit happens.
Bulgaria, where my family's from, sided with the Nazis.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So they can kill two birds with one stone there. They can say we're the liberators, plus our enemies at the time were simultaneously nationalists and anti-Semites, so we win there. And they're right, they were. There's no doubt about that. That's not all nationalists in the Ukraine were out to kill Jews, but a fair number of the collaborators obviously collaborated in that regard.
And Poland's more complicated because of its long history and the national identity there. These particular brand of the church that was there, which had to be both more zealous and also milder. I mean, I know that sounds strange because we always think today like Polish Catholics are the most hardcore, not Latin American Catholics.
Well, what's funny about this, when they talk about the Catholic Church in Poland and how it changed, it's funny, during the communist period, and in particular the 70s and the 80s, it was a much more liberal, almost liberation theology type organization than anything else. It was an organization where the anti-communists, regardless of whether or not they were atheist, Jewish, what have you, could go speak freely and find some sort of protection from the state. After 1989, it became what we think of Polish Catholicism now, which was hardcore, like almost like, like we get in the hardcore religion in the United States, anti-abortion, all of this, decadent, movies and this, that, and the other. They should, be on their knees praying to God type thing. It is as much a modern-ish phenomenon there as it is here. The church changed many, many times, but this is the nature of all things, right?
Right, and the Polish Catholic Church is fascinating in itself, and we only have to deal with it in the context of this movie. I mean, in a way, the whole Rumspringa-like quality to this setup, which I'm assuming actually must have happened. I mean, they must have actually done this, because otherwise this would have struck someone as a completely false plot chord, is something that you wouldn't see, say, in Ireland at the time. I mean, I don't think they would have told girls to go out, talk to your family, make sure you understand what you're doing.
And I think in this film, though, I think the reason I give it a bit of a pass is because of the extenuating circumstances of Ida's background, right?
And they would know that. The Mother Superior knows that.
Yeah, the Mother Superior knows it. She just she phrased it in such a way to allow Ida to discover it, as opposed to just saying, "Hey, you're a Jew. You better go check out your background," kind of thing. It's not like.
So let's talk about what I think is one of the most pivotal moments of the movie. So they go and find the old man, and the old man describes how good Ida's parents are, and that he fed them, and then Wanda accuses him of killing them, and he just goes silent. We find out something about 10 minutes later that's devastating to that. I mean, Wanda, and to be fair, like, you really feel for Wanda, because she's like breaking down when she's accusing him of this.
Right.
And Ida's just sort of taking it in. She comforts Wanda. I mean, it's interesting because you would expect it to be the other way around, because obviously Ida is way younger and way more innocent. But she actually, from that point forward, is primarily comforting her aunt. She doesn't have there is no hostility between them anymore.
As I said, it's almost, I wouldn't say it's emotionless for Ida, but in a regard, the death of her parents, for her, is more of an intellectual exercise, because she just never knew them. It's emotional for her, exactly like you said, because she clearly can tell that her aunt is suffering in a very extreme way from this, for obvious reasons, right? And there was also a line, I think Wanda said, that says, "I left them alone," right? With them. So what we do find out after, they talk to the old man, and they're in the hotel, the son of the old man, who they encountered when they first went to the home, says, "I will tell you where they're buried, under the condition that you leave my father alone and let him die in peace, and you don't make any claims to the property." And Ida's fine with this.
Yeah, she doesn't want to live there anyway. And honestly, neither will the aunt, because the aunt has better property, way better property, as we see later.
That's another interesting detail, and I think that's, in its minimalist way, speaks wonderfully of the situation of communism at the time, which was that her apartment, while spacious and much better than anybody else is going to get in most regards, still feels sort of bland and dingy.
Oh yeah. It's interesting. And when I say it's like way bigger, I mean, it's like, obviously it's a pretty big apartment. I thought maybe it was almost like a townhouse, but by American standards, it's still going to be, even of the 60s, it's still going to be like, okay, you have a Victrola,
right?
You got some space.
There's
books.
You have butter and bread.
Yeah, and some sugar.
Which, frankly, my parents and grandparents ate bread that way. With the bread, white rye bread or white bread, butter, and put sugar on it. I don't know if this is a Polish thing or if it's just a thing of the time. That's how my parents and grandparents ate bread. That struck home a little bit. I
was actually seeing that because I was thinking about the Eastern European part of my family, and they do that too.
Yeah, my father said like it got really exciting when you had a banana and you could put banana slices on it.
Like, the southern part of my family would be like, why doesn't that have like shortening and? But yeah, it's just interesting. But that compression of time. I mean, really, you talk about. So they go back to the house, and the son takes them out there, and this scene is powerful.
Right.
The one thing I wanted to point out before we get to that, though, is she would not shake the son's hand.
No.
So she did judge him.
So it's interesting because I think this is what's great about a minimalist film. There can be so many readings to it. I was thinking about this too. Why didn't she shake his hand? Though I read that as a handshake is an earthly, manifestation of like a deal's a deal. If she says agreed, she will agree to it because to lie would be a sin.
Right.
And in her mind, she judges him largely in that regard. He is a man of just like material, base materiality in that regard. But I think you may be right though. She could, she may be well aware that this man did a monstrous thing, and she's also judging him from that.
I don't know that she knows that he did a monstrous thing, although she seems more aware of who actually is guilty than her aunt, which is interesting since her aunt was a prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
Because she doesn't show any hint of hardness towards the old man. Maybe it's because he's dying, but she doesn't even seem to. I don't know, because the reveal that we're going to get to, and go ahead and spoil it, is that the son's the one who killed them, not the father.
Right. So as he's digging to basically pull the bones out, he pulls them out and then just completely breaks down.
Right, and that's also a super pivotal and powerful scene because he's sitting in this grave and he's almost in the fetal position. And they pull out the bones and they hand the bones to. The first thing is the aunt wraps a skull in her headscarf.
Right, and there's a third victim we haven't mentioned, which is a little boy, which I think is Wanda's son.
Right.
So the story goes why they died. Basically, it's near the end, and if it's one of those things where, and again, this is an important detail that Poles intuitively know no one else may get. To protect a Jewish family in Poland was a death sentence if they caught you. So, and it's the only country where it was officially a death sentence. And the deaths was a protective measure, and it's not anti-Semitic as you would think, in part because of the fact that Ida lived. So if you listen to why he did it, he said, I didn't want my father to have to deal with this. You couldn't tell that Ida was a Jew, so we sent her off to the Catholic monastery to protect her. The boy was circumcised so they could figure it out, and I think obviously the adults could be figured out. So in order to protect his family, he killed them.
Right, which is hard. I mean, it says a lot because it's interesting because Wanda doesn't get mad. Wanda just almost breaks down and starts drinking. But as soon as they get back to the car, but she's not mad at him, or she's mad at him, but not in the way that she was. Like she doesn't accuse him. There's no threats made.
Right, exactly. And like I said, it could have easily turned into, the Poles were inherently anti-Semitic all along kind of story. This really isn't that situation. And again, given the nature of who died and who didn't and why, sort of, gives you an understanding of that. And that to me is more devastating than if you had done, obviously, the other way. And it reminds me of a line, I think Hannah Arendt did it, when she was talking about basically the Jewish leaders who helped in their own way to facilitate the Holocaust. She had said, this isn't, to understand their complicity is not to blame the victims as much as it is to recognize how devastating the fascist destruction of everything is that it perverted everything, not just itself, but also the victims.
Right. So you have this family that's trying to save this Jewish family, and particularly the old man, which is it seems like now why he wanted to protect the old man seems even like that seems even worse because they're sitting here accusing this guy who did really try to save their lives of killing them with an axe at one point, and then you just discover like no, that's not what happened at all. He was trying to save their lives. The son was trying to save his family's life,
Right.
and but all this is subtextual. I mean, some of it's said, but you have to figure it out, and you have to kind of know what the costs are in Poland for because why else would a family that had sincerely tried to protect these Jews for months, it seems like, just turn and kill them at the end of the
Right. If you that important detail is never explicitly said, and if you don't know it, the killing doesn't make any sense, which would lead an audience to say, "Oh, you know, Polish anti-Semitism," which really isn't the situation. And even then, it's a bad reading of the film based on what even is actually said.
right. Because they send Ida off because they know she'll be safe in the convent, and they'll know to figure out she's Jewish. It'll all be okay, but they can't save this family and save themselves. Now, this breaks the aunt.
Right.
I think what people in the States won't get is why it breaks her, because if they don't catch that it breaks her because it's a tragedy that she can't place blame on. She can't persecute anyone who's still alive for this. It's just horrible.
Right, no, exactly, and it says in my mind why she became a prosecutor, or why she became a Stalinist in a way. Not everything, but partially. As a prosecutor, and why she could be so harsh on the Polish nationalists is in a sort of sublimated way. I will punish those who killed my family. In going back to the source of the trauma, she realizes that I can't, there's no easily punishable answer. Yes, there's guilt, but it's so messy and so, for lack of a better term, and I hope people don't read this the wrong way, I'm meaning it in the Burkean sense, sublime, that it's terrifying. She can't do anything anymore. In other words, and you get the sense from someone.
Yeah, the guilty parties aren't anyone she could access because they're not even Polish, probably. I mean, it's just
right. It's like, and she's been going on a self-destructive path throughout the movie. Her time of importance is going up. She drinks herself, to drunken stupor. She wants to go out dancing, but she finds no comfort, no intimacy.
She doesn't seem to really believe in Stalinism anymore, even though it's not really discussed. But she doesn't act like an apparatchik at all.
No. The only time she uses it is to get something she wants, and right. Even then, it's more bureaucratic than ideological, if that makes sense.
Right. She's not a Stalinist true believer anymore. If she ever was, she has a one night stand with some dude. Ida goes back to the convent. You see the beginnings of the vow ceremony, which Ida doesn't take yet. You just watch some other girls go through it. There is a weirdly kind of sexual scene in that I don't know what to make of.
Well, there's one funny thing I do like, because she's getting ready to take the vows and she's going through the processes. But there's a little scene where I think when she's eating, she just starts giggling, obviously to the annoyance of the nuns. But yeah, you get to say, as she's going through it, she's like, "I'm not ready. There's something lingering here."
Right. She watches those two girls bathe, and it's not like it's sensual and sexual, but it's not like she's attracted to them. It's just she's like, there's something I don't understand. And it does seem like there's a point that her aunt made about having to understand what you're giving up that is part of what she does adopt. Like, she does take in the one valid point her aunt made to her. But I want to get, before we get that, I want to get to the burial scene, because that's also traumatic and honest. So they find this Jewish cemetery that's, they're not even sure it's still there because so many of them have been pulled up.
Right.
And they talk about getting, Ida goes, well, we should get a priest, and Wanda corrects her, and says, no, you mean a rabbi. And she kind of goes, yeah, I guess I do. I mean, she doesn't say this, but her face is, yeah, I guess I do.
Right.
But I don't even know what this means. But they do take the bodies to this and bury them like by hand in the family plot. And that's a pretty devastating scene too. But when you see this cemetery, it's like the forest has grown up around it. It hasn't been maintained.
Right. It's an abandoned cemetery, essentially.
And they just drop it in the they drop these bones in the family plot, don't really get markers. They don't end up getting a rabbi. And then she goes back. And then you have the scenes where she's watching the girls bathe, and then she starts giggling. And then she watches some of the other girls take their vows, but she doesn't yet. And it's almost, this point is a little bit of plot convenience, but like at the same time, after this one night stand her aunt has, in a actually beautiful scene that reminds me of Jean Delmont. Like this, did that scene remind you of Jean Delmont too? Like how still and going through the exact motions that it is?
Yeah, there was definitely a shall we say a ritualization of what she's about to do.
Right, she like aggressively eats bread with sugar and butter.
Yeah.
But I mean, and then like puts on some classical music, and then like paces around, puts on a nice overcoat, and I actually didn't see this coming. Like nonchalantly jumps out, like doesn't even really jump. She just kind of speed walks out the window to her death.
So it's interesting. I was interested to see your reaction to it. I anticipated it when I
didn't see it coming. So
yeah, because I think because I watched it a second time, and I had suspected it the first time, but I was right in seeing it the second time that if you're gonna when you have a character kill herself or himself, you almost have to start killing them off from scene one. And with Vanda's character, you do get the sense in this movie that they were preparing for her death since the first time we see her. And I think that's probably why when I saw the window in the center of the frame, then I saw her open it, even though she's wandering around, I said, she's going out the window.
It's such a stark scene. It's a weirdly beautiful scene. And it doesn't linger on her jumping. It lingers on the window and the space.
Right.
I mean, so you just sort of like watch the window, see her pace, pace out the window. Done.
Right.
And then lingers on the room for, I don't know, maybe 3 more seconds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we see Ida in the apartment and at her funeral. And importantly, when Ida's at the funeral, she is not wearing her veil.
Yeah, she takes that off. And then she puts on her aunt's clothes later on.
Right.
Now, what do you make of this? Because I do think she's mourning her aunt. She doesn't show a lot of emotion. This actress is amazing in that she shows emotion, but you really, really have to watch her face.
Yes, it's very subtle the way she does it. So what I read it 2 ways. One is, you're right, there's a mourning of her aunt, but as a byproduct of that mourning and also of her statement a little earlier that she's not ready to take her vows, I think by putting on her aunt's clothing, she is attempting to explore this alternative identity that may be available to her by virtue of everything she's discovered, right? So she puts her in her aunt's clothing. She drinks a little bit of vodka. I mean, by little bit, like very little. I mean, she tries to smoke and does so poorly, as one would expect. She twirls around a little bit, falls over, and then she has a one-night stand with the musician that we encountered slightly earlier.
Which is the only thing she does really successfully.
It's true, and even then, you get a sense that perhaps it was quick. Kind of.
Yeah, well, but I mean, she does. They do. She flirts with him. They have kind of a romantic moment. They talk about running off, and for a second, you think, okay, she's going to embrace this identity, right? She's going to be this secular person, but then when she gets up to leave, because the other thing that I think is implied that she's inherited the house.
Right, I mean, it's highly likely. I mean, who else is it going to go to? you know.
Right. I mean, like it could go back to the state, but
Well, that's right.
it's implied that she's inherited the house, or if she wants it, it could be hers. Because you don't you get the feeling that now, like, she's not going back to the convent because she has to, because it's the only option she has. Like, she doesn't own anything. She's going back to the convent really because she wants to. I mean,
I think so. That's my reading of it. I got the sense that after her, night with the musician, and she's asking him, like, what were we gonna do next? And he says, well, get married and have children. She says, and what about after that? He says, I don't know, life and stuff and whatnot. You got the sense that he didn't, in her mind, he didn't convince her of a sort of commitment to something greater or something more substantial. Because remember, her aunt manifested in its own way a material life, or a life outside of religious asceticism, and she couldn't make something out of it. Obviously, she ended it very tragically, and it's complicated by a tragedy in her earlier life,
and the fact that she also probably now. Because here's what I think: the movie sets it up for you to misread it, why she did it. Because at first, the only thing she talks about is why would she cover her hair? Like, why won't she share her hair with the world? And you're like, well, why is that? Like, what drives her over the edge? Mm-hmm. But then you realize, like, she's got a lot of guilt. Not just about... I mean, the fact that she was wrong about the old man is also got to indicate that she was wrong about a lot of other stuff she did in the 50s. And I think Polish audiences will pick this up. American audiences aren't going to catch that. I mean...
I don't know how they could unless they just know the history. And that's not something, I'd hate to say this, but it's true. It's not something I do or should expect of an American audience.
No, I mean, like, you would have to catch up that, like, being a prosecutor would have meant she was a Stalinist, and what that would have meant in the 50s specifically in Poland would have meant that she was basically a purge trial lawyer. And while she gets a state funeral, and it is attended by a few people, but it's not like she dies and just Ida's there, because that would have been actually really lame. But you do get the feeling that, like, even though, like, she's also part of a past, they're not, like, that the Polish Communist Party isn't really proud of either.
No, they respect her, but they'd like to forget her. Again, as I said, it's the context of the time. The Gomulka period. Now, a little bit later on, it'll get more hard line again, and maybe they'll look fondly on her, but it's relevant at this point. They go through the motions. They play the Internationale at her funeral, blah 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 blah. But
the only time you hear "comrade" in the movie, and you're reminded, oh yeah, this is a communist country.
Right. Exactly. It doesn't. It's one of those things where, again, it's minimalism. It's like it's never stated, but it's in the DNA. Of the film. It's like it requires. This is again why I thought this is the interesting topic to go through. There's so much history at play here and history at play which you are expected to know in many regards. That I'm just so surprised that it translates. But I think it translates again largely because of the beauty of the film, and then the way it's playing with this question of identity. It's funny. The director.
You don't cynically think it's translating because people mistake it for a Holocaust movie.
I'll tell you one thing that does annoy me. Every film critic in America who's wrote about this movie and sung its praises, and I'm happy they look highly on the film, nevertheless feel it is necessary in the introduction of their review to speak about the history of Poland in a holistic statement, which reveals how little they know, and to me, how little they must have really read into this movie. Dana Stevens did it, David Denby did it, A.O. Scott did it, and they all took it in a way sort of like where you're at. I think they're clever enough to know that it's not a pure Showa movie, but they do think of it in that vernacular, which is a mistake.
Right, which is where this movie is actually a strangely... I mean, I would say it's kind of a pro-Jewish Catholic movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In my mind, it's a very Christian religious movie, and I don't think it's a surprise, and I think you would probably caught this too, that the music at the end we leave on when Ida is going back to the convent is it's from Tarkovsky's Solaris. It's the central theme of Solaris.
Right. And I just think that there's so much subtlety in that. Like when you see that, I think again, I think anyone can see this as a kind of dark movie, but if you read it without knowing all those notes of what's going on about, and you don't read it as as kind of a redemption story. Also, just knowing that some tragedies are true. I mean, are actually truly tragic, and by that I mean that no one did anything out of spite or out of hate. Exactly. Like there's hate involved. There's anti-Semitism involved. There's also love involved and philo-Semitism involved, even in the same people.
Right. The crime that is central to the story is, for all parties involved, an act of desperation.
And the movie sort of the sort of Catholic view of the world that comes away with is that, this is a fallen world, and look how much there's still beauty in it anyway, but it is definitely fallen.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think you even get a sense with when Wanda looks back on her on Ida, you get a sense that Wanda is jealous. May be the wrong word. Maybe envious is right in that, because frankly, despite all of this, Ida doesn't hate anyone. She is not an earthly person in that regard. Wanda,
Right.
for all her desires to be in control and to have some sort of, even if it's twisted by history, an attempt to seek justice, she hasn't found the peace that Ida just innately has.
Right. And the movie is forgiving of her. It doesn't cast harsh judgment on her. It's not about her shame. But it does just say, like, this didn't lead anywhere. She didn't get what she wanted because she couldn't. There was no way for her to ever get justice. And Ida's not concerned with that. She's concerned with God and peace and other things. And her face is like, that's why the implacable stare that this movie is interesting. And then it gets away with having the protagonist stare at the camera a lot. And it's moving. Even it doesn't just work. Like it's powerful because you just watch her eyes and you realize you don't exactly know what she's thinking, and you're only given subtle cues, and the film's not going to give you that.
Right. I don't think we really walk away with a view to Ida's inner life. In the same way that we really don't get a view of Jean Dalman's inner life too.
No, you get the view of the consequences of the inner life, and this is a very good movie to contrast with Jean Dalman because they have a similar pace. Even though one movie is like 3.5 hours long.
Right. One's 3 hours long, the other is like 85 minutes long.
And I will say, even though I talk about how slowly this movie's paced, it doesn't feel slow. It's weird.
It doesn't feel drawn out. It doesn't feel excessive too either. It definitely is taking its time, and you notice it's taking its time, but you don't. Let me put it this way: I never sort of had to look at my watch and say, "Are we almost done yet?"
Yeah, and I'm not gonna lie. With John Dalman, there are a few points in that movie where I'm like, "Oh my god, this movie is so long." And I like that movie, but it's just
no. I liked it the strongest of the three of us who talked about it, and even I was looking at the clock every 10 minutes. But I think that's the intent of that film. I think that film wants you to look at the clock.
This is really long and uncomfortable. Nothing happens for 2 hours. No. No, it's just. I was taking psychological notes in a way about how I have been trained to watch films. And how a lot of these Central European films mess with that. And I do sometimes wonder if I'd grown up with Central European cinema, would this just feel normal?
Well, the other important little detail, and I think we talked about it when we talked about Jean Delmas, is that Chantal Ackerman's family is Polish Jewish.
Yeah.
And Jean Delmas is in part inspired by the way that her secular Jewish mother ritualized life outside of the Jewish faith.
That's eerie. I remembered when we talked about that, but now I'm thinking about that. Oh, we see that twice. And it ends tragically both times.
Right.
Like ritualism without its substance doesn't seem to go well for anybody.
It's a very, very interesting connection. I mean, I feel like I could think on that more and add some more, but I think the religiosity is important. And you know what's funny? The other thing I heard from the director about the responses he got to the movie when he shows the movie, and there's a Q&A afterwards, he says there are some like Poland responded very well to the movie. There were some Poles whose response was, do we have to have another film about Poles killing Jews? And again, I'd say they missed the point. And then the Jewish community in America, I think it was in New York, some of the Jewish community in America's response was, at the ending, they said, why did you have Ida make the wrong choice at the end? In other words, why didn't she become a Jew? Kind of thing. And
well, that's what I was expecting. Like if Spielberg, wrote this, she would have returned back to her Jewish roots. I can tell you, as a person who has kind of gone through that, I don't know that she could. Frankly, I don't know that would have been a false ending to that character.
I completely agree. It just was never a part of her. That's as I said, in my mind, her Jewish identity was almost a whole ex nihilo rather than a sort of nugget of, almost like a positive nugget of which, if you opened it up, would be, a Jewish life that was never there for her. It never was an option.
Right, and I think I'm about to say something that might get me in trouble. Sometimes I feel like the American Jewish community thinks that that Jewishness is a magical gene that you could just as soon as you know about it, you can magically manifest speaking Yiddish. And
right.
And as a person who, I when I was very young, I did not know about my Jewish background. I was raised with that in the background, and it became explicit when I was older. But when I was very young, I didn't know. Even with being raised in it a good bit, there are parts of it that do feel alien to me. And I cannot imagine what it would be like trying to integrate it when you are raised completely outside of it in every form or fashion.
Well, I think related to this thought you have is my response to that American Jewish response, which even as a non-religious person, it kind of bothered me, which was implicit in that assumption was that a lifetime of Catholic theological teaching and preparing yourself to be a nun is something so easily swept away just because you flick a switch on.
Right. And also a lifetime of Jewish learning that you didn't have.
Exactly. So like I can think what both of those responses, the Polish response that, another story about Poles killing Jews, and then also the Jewish response of why didn't she become a Jew, misses the human core of the film, which is its religious core, but religious in that sort of in what the Catholic ideal was, the universality of religion, which was an attempt to recognize a wretchedness of being a human in the world and an attempt to offer some kind of peace or salvation to it. That is a story which is theoretically applicable to anybody, regardless of whether or not they're Jewish, Catholic, Polish, American, what have you. I think those attitudes and those readings of the film are a truly tragic misreading, which unfortunately miss the core impact of the film.
Yeah, I think maybe what bothers me about these identitarian readings is that they really have a hollow notion of what these identities are. I mean, one of the things this movie seems to be about is she even though she can put on the clothes and do those things, those things they're not they're going to feel alien to her. She has a chance to choose that life. She doesn't do it. She doesn't do it for a reason. And I think you just can't hand wave that away. And I think that's an honest answer to that problem. I don't think in real life, particularly in that context, because the church is taking care of her. She's not, they don't persecute her.
Exactly. You never got a sense that the Mother Superior, because the Mother Superior obviously knows her Jewish background, thinks of Ida as a lesser, potential nun.
And so, like, why would she? What possible reason would she have to turn that away, except in honoring her family? But in a way, to me, that would be completely false. Like, she has honored her family the best way she knows how, which is to give them an approximation of a Jewish burial, to mourn them and to mourn her aunt, who she obviously views as tragic, I think.
Oh, I think so too. I think there obviously were times at the movie where she was antagonistic to the aunt, but at the end, no. I mean, that she recognized the pain that her aunt was in. Ida is also, in that way, more in her empathy with everyone, is more Christian than any of her Christian fellow nuns, the Mother Superior, even the priest that we do see.
Right. They're not portrayed as hostile or uncaring, but they're just not part of that world at all.
Right.
And the aunt actually does make some good points, and this is a very subtle point that I just realized talking to you right now, where the aunt says, your Jesus loved people like me,
right,
or drunk, and she gets mad and goes out, and like that's when she flirts with the boy. But in the rest of the movie, she is really soft and caring and compassionate and loving towards her aunt, and she quits judging her.
Yeah, exactly. No, totally right. She I think in this movie, in a way, it's again like the potential outcome of a Rungspring event. She went out into the world. She challenged her beliefs, and she realized that she believed them more than ever.
And she chose the life she's going to choose. It would be interesting to see what this character was like in the 80s or something, but I don't think that movie should be made. I'd just be interested to know.
It would have been, you mean like, what would Ida Part 2, Gdansk?
Yeah. the last thing I want is another, to have foreign films that are art movies become franchises, but...
I just love the idea of an Ida 2.
It's just like, I feel like I'm making, a bunch of movie critics roll over in their desk and or graves. But there is something fascinating about that character that I would want to revisit that character later, but I also don't want to revisit that character because, dear God, please don't turn this sweet gem of a movie into a franchise. I am surprised that it is a breakout film, though. Like, sincerely surprised it's a breakout film because it is so rooted in Polishness. It is so differently paced. It is stunningly beautiful. I'll give it that, and also stunningly beautiful about things that are quite bleak. I mean, it's the pictures and stuff are very honest. The snow does not look pretty. And one thing we haven't mentioned, but I think it's vital that it's shot in black and white. I mean, it's very crisp, clear black and white, but very much in black and white.
Right. You couldn't imagine this as a Technicolor movie. Obviously, it would completely destroy the aesthetic. And if it was in color, it would be in that sort of desaturated kind of way that certain color films are made. They're sometimes called black and white in color. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And
yeah,
again,
I could only imagine this in sepia and blue if it's not in black and white.
Right.
I mean,
and again, I think it's implicit reflection of the Polish films at the time. I mean, yes, there were Polish color films, but most Polish films, particularly the very memorable ones, were in black and white, and I think that's part and parcel of reproducing the flavor of the time. And I think, and again, that's a manifestation again of where, yes, I can see why there are certain elements of this film which really lend itself to the potential of becoming a breakout film that that people of all audiences would respond to. I mean, I absolutely can see that, but I think that reflection of the film is a partial view. You know, internationally, I feel like the vast majority of people are only going to get a partial taste of what's really in store in this film and what it's offering and where its heart is in a weird way. I think they get a sense of where its heart is, but I think they'll miss a lot of the important nuances which really sell it home. And that's, I think, a story of Polish cinema in general. I mean, some of the very famous Polish films, almost all of the real famous ones, particularly those from pre-1989, are so obsessed with either the history of the country or the particular condition of the country at the time in which it was made that it's just so hard to, get an audience to really pick up on it all. I mean, and even like one of the most important Polish plays is The Wedding of Wesela, and it is the best way to describe it, and it's not perfect, is to think about The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and all of the sort of shards of cultural history that go in to understanding the wasteland and how difficult people have just in reading that. And imagine that kind of construct, but limit it to one country and have it be even more extreme minutia of Polish history and mythology, and then you get a sense of what that movie is. I guarantee you that film's going to have a hard time playing. It did play internationally recently, as I think, as a result of this movie, and then also Martin Scorsese having a series of 21 classic Polish films that he was touring around the United States with. I think there's an interest in it, and Wesela was one of the films of that 21, I believe. There is potential for like people to discover it, but again, it's so hard to get all those details. And it's a shame because, like, if you really look at the output, I mean, the only other European rivals in terms of film quality and artfulness of the sort of 60s through in Poland's case, like the mid 90s period was France and Italy.
France and Italy, and yeah, it's funny. I was actually thinking, like, I feel like I know Italian cinema pretty well. I feel like I've been exposed and told to like French cinema a lot, which I do. I'm being kind of snooty. But I do feel like, and I feel like I actually know Russian cinema kind of well.
Right.
But I do feel like Polish cinema is this big open, like, how did I miss this?
And I've just been rediscovering it myself, and fortunately, this is one of the nuggets of the communist history which we can at least say gave us some advantage. The two big studios of the communist system, Kadr, KADR, and Tor, have a huge catalog of Polish films that they released for free on YouTube, and many of them are translated into English, of which included are like two of Krzysztof Kieslowski's films on from the Decalogue, the ones that were made into longer feature films, Żuławski movies, other Kieslowski films. You go throughout the whole spiel, like a lot of them are there, and they're available, and hopefully people want to put the effort in, they can see them.